In the heart of Manhattan, on one of the most expensive streets on earth, there stands a mansion that does not behave like the others. Fifth Avenue is lined with wealth, with old money townhouses and polished facades designed to impress. Yet this building feels different. It does not invite admiration. It does not signal comfort. It looms. Gothic spires rise toward the sky. Stonework carved with obsessive precision, windows tall and narrow, as if designed more to watch than to welcome. The marble staircase descends toward the sidewalk, like the entrance to a European palace, utterly out of place in modern New York. People slow their steps here. Some stop. Most don't know why. They only sense that this house carries weight. This is the Woolworth Mansion, one of the most expensive private residences ever built in America. A palace constructed not by royalty, not by old aristocracy, but by a man who once counted nickels and dimes for a living. Frank Woolworth built this house to make a statement so large it could not be ignored. He believed architecture could do what money alone could not. He believed stone, marble, and scale could force society to acknowledge his worth. From the outside, the mansion is magnificent. Inside, it is even more overwhelming. Imported marble from Italy, carved by craftsmen whose techniques had not changed in centuries. Wood paneling shipped from England, assembled without nails, fitted together like a cathedral. A ballroom designed for hundreds of guests, a staircase meant to be admired in silence. Everything about this house was built to declare success. And yet, from the very beginning, something was wrong. This mansion was never a home. It was a message, a demand, a challenge aimed directly at New York's most powerful families, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, families whose names opened doors that even vast fortunes could not. Frank Woolworth had wealth beyond imagination, but he remained an outsider, a merchant, a shopkeeper, a man whose fortune came from spare change. And in the rigid social hierarchies of early 20th century New York, that distinction mattered more than money. So, Woolworth did what he had always done. He built something bigger. He built something impossible to dismiss. A palace on Fifth Avenue that rivaled European estates and American dynasties alike. He believed that once this house stood, society would have no choice but to accept him. He believed the mansion would complete his transformation, that it would erase the memory of poverty, of sickness, of being looked down upon. But houses have a way of revealing truths rather than hiding them. Behind the marble and gold, the Woolworth Mansion became something else entirely, a place of isolation, of obsession, of family collapse. Within its walls, madness took root. Loneliness echoed through rooms designed for celebration. Dreams did not flourish here, they decayed. This is not the story of a successful businessman who built a beautiful home. This is the story of a man who tried to purchase belonging and instead constructed his own prison. This is the story of a house that outlived its purpose, survived its owner, and carried the consequences of his ambition long after his death. To understand why this mansion feels so heavy, why it unsettles those who pass by more than a century later, we have to go back before the money, before Fifth Avenue, before the marble and the towers. We have to return to the beginning, to a sickly boy born into shame who would spend his entire life trying to escape it. Frank Woolworth was not born into privilege, he was born into scarcity. In April of 1852, in a small farming community near the Canadian border, he entered a world that had already decided his place within it. Rodman, New York, was quiet, isolated, and unforgiving. The land was poor, the winters were long, the work was endless, and the rewards were barely enough to survive. His father owned a small farm, but ownership meant little when the soil refused to cooperate, and debt hovered over every season like a threat that never left. Frank was a sickly child from the beginning. His lungs were weak. Respiratory infections confined him to bed for weeks at a time, watching life happen without him. While other boys learned strength through labor, Frank learned fragility through illness. He could not keep up in the fields. He could not endure the physical demands that defined manhood in rural America. His body betrayed him early, and with that betrayal came something deeper, something that would shape his entire life. The belief that he was inadequate. Poverty is not just the absence of money. It is the presence of shame. Frank felt it in the clothes that never fit, passed down until they were threadbare. He felt it in the meals his mother stretched too thin, pretending there was enough when there was not. He felt it in the looks from neighbors who measured worth by productivity and endurance, qualities he lacked. Even as a child, Frank understood that the world had categories and that he had been placed firmly at the bottom. His parents saw little future for him. The farm required strength, and Frank had none to spare. There was no inheritance waiting, no safety net, no path upward, only survival. By 16, Frank knew he could not remain. Staying meant disappearing. Leaving meant risk, but also possibility. So he left the farm and took a position as a store clerk in nearby Watertown. The job paid nothing for months. He slept above the store. He ate whatever was offered. He endured humiliation quietly, telling himself this was temporary. The commerce, not labor, would be his escape. It did not go well. His health failed again. Weak and defeated, Frank returned home. The humiliation was complete. He had tried to rise and fallen back into the same dirt he had fled. For many, this would have been the end of ambition. For Frank Woolworth, it became confirmation. He was not meant for the life he was born into. He was meant for something else, even if he could not yet see what that something was. What he carried forward from these years was not confidence. It was resentment, a quiet, burning resentment toward a world that valued strength over intelligence, heritage over effort, appearance over ability. Frank Woolworth did not dream of luxury. He dreamed of never being looked down upon again. He dreamed of a world where value could be measured objectively, where a person could not be dismissed simply because of where they came from. That dream would eventually reshape American retail. But long before it built an empire, it carved something darker into Frank Woolworth himself. A wound that never healed, a need that could never be satisfied, and a hunger not just for money, but for recognition that would drive him forward no matter the cost. Because from the moment he left that farm, Frank Woolworth was no longer running toward success. He was running away from shame, and the farther he ran, the more it followed him. When Frank Woolworth left the farm for the second time, he carried no illusions with him. Failure had stripped those away. What remained was observation. He watched people. He watched how they moved through stores, how they hesitated, how their eyes dropped when they spoke to clerks who stood behind counters like gatekeepers of dignity. In 19th century America, shopping was not a neutral act. Prices were hidden. Merchandise was kept out of reach. Customers had to ask, and in asking, they exposed themselves to judgment. Clerks decided what something cost based not on its value, but on who was standing in front of them. Frank understood this humiliation intimately. He had lived it. As a clerk, he saw the quiet calculations in customers' faces, the discomfort of negotiation, the shame of being sized up. And he noticed something else. People were not unwilling to spend. They were unwilling to be embarrassed. The system itself was broken, designed to remind working people of their place. Frank did not think in terms of revolution. He thought in terms of fairness. What if the price was the same for everyone? What if a nickel meant a nickel, no matter who held it? The idea was dangerously simple. Fixed prices, visible merchandise, no negotiation, no judgment. When he finally convinced a store owner to let him try it, they placed a small table near the front of the shop. Everything on it cost 5 cents. Frank arranged the items carefully, making sure they were easy to see, easy to touch, easy to understand. On the first day, The table sold out within hours. Customers returned. Word spread. People felt something rare and unfamiliar in a retail space. Respect. To Frank Woolworth, this was not just a business insight, it was personal validation. The system worked because it corrected something unjust. He believed that if dignity could be standardized, so could success. He pushed further. Entire stores built on the same principle. 5-cent items, then 10-cent items. High volume, low margins, constant turnover. He failed once, then again. But unlike before, each failure taught him something measurable. Location mattered. Inventory mattered. Foot traffic mattered. Pride did not. When the formula finally clicked, it did not explode overnight. It grew steadily, methodically, store by store, city by city. The profits were small at first, but they accumulated. Nickels became dollars. Dollars became thousands. By the time America realized what was happening, Woolworth stores were everywhere. Working families flooded them. Not because the stores were luxurious, but because they were humane. No one was talked down to. No one was judged. The experience itself felt revolutionary. Frank Woolworth became wealthy by serving the people society ignored. He turned the humiliation of his own past into a system that eliminated it for others, and for a time it felt like redemption. He had beaten the odds. He had escaped poverty. He had proven his intelligence, his discipline, his worth. But success did not erase memory. The boy who had been ashamed never disappeared. He simply learned how to wear better clothes. As his fortune grew, Frank began to believe something quietly dangerous. He believed money would eventually close the distance between him and those who had always looked down on him. He believed wealth was the final test, the ultimate proof, that once he reached a certain level, acceptance would follow naturally. What he did not yet understand was that the world he was trying to enter did not operate on logic or merit. It operated on lineage, and no amount of nickels and dimes could buy a family name. The revolution Frank Woolworth built changed how America shopped, but it did not change how America judged. And as his bank accounts grew, so did the gap between what he had achieved and what he still wanted. The success that should have satisfied him instead sharpened his hunger. Because now, for the first time, he was close enough to the gates of elite society to see that they were still closed, and that realization would lead him down a far more destructive path than poverty ever had. By the turn of the 20th century, Frank Woolworth had everything he had once believed would save him. His stores stretched across the country. His name appeared in newspapers. His fortune had grown into the tens of millions, a sum so large it placed him among the richest men in America. From the outside, the story looked complete. A poor farm boy rises, conquers commerce, and claims his place among the powerful. But New York did not operate on stories. It operated on bloodlines. The city's elite families had been rich long before Woolworth arrived, and more importantly, they had been recognized long before him. Their wealth came from railroads, finance, land, and inheritance. It came wrapped in legitimacy. Woolworth's money came from trade, from stores, from nickels and dimes exchanged by working people. In the rigid social order of the Gilded Age, that distinction mattered more than the number on a balance sheet. Woolworth was invited into rooms, but never fully welcomed. He attended dinners where conversation softened when he approached. He received polite acknowledgments that never turned into lasting friendships. The old families treated him as a curiosity, a novelty, the merchant who had done remarkably well, but had somehow skipped the most important step. He lacked pedigree. He lacked refinement, they said. What they meant was simpler and more brutal. He did not belong. Every interaction reinforced the same lesson. Wealth could open doors, but it could not erase origins. Woolworth felt this exclusion acutely. He had escaped poverty only to discover another form of confinement, one built not of scarcity but of invisible walls. He was rich enough to see the world he wanted to enter, but never close enough to be inside it. And for a man whose life had been defined by effort and discipline, this was intolerable. So he responded the only way he knew how. He doubled down. He bought better clothes, more expensive jewelry for his wife, larger homes in better neighborhoods. He hired servants. He hosted dinners. Each purchase was an attempt to speak the language of status more fluently. Each move was calculated to signal that he had arrived, but the signals were never returned. The reactions remained the same: courteous, distant, dismissive. Woolworth began to understand that success alone was not enough. The elite were not impressed by money they had not lost, nor by effort they had never needed. They valued permanence, history, the sense that their position in the world was inevitable, and nothing terrified them more than the idea that someone could simply buy his way into their circle. Their resistance hardened as Woolworth pushed closer. What began as frustration slowly transformed into obsession. Woolworth no longer wanted acceptance in private. He wanted recognition in public. He wanted something so visible, so undeniable, that it would force society to confront him on his terms. If names could not be changed, symbols could. If lineage could not be rewritten, architecture could. He stopped thinking about belonging as a social process and started thinking of it as a physical one, something that could be constructed, something that could be seen, something that could not be ignored. The same mind that had standardized dignity in retail now turned toward a far more dangerous idea, that status itself could be engineered. This was the moment when the mansion stopped being a house and became a necessity, not a place to live, but a weapon, a monument designed to overwhelm doubt and silence condescension. Woolworth convinced himself that once such a structure existed, the old families would have no choice but to acknowledge him. That stone and scale would accomplish what decades of success had not. What he failed to see was that the people he sought to impress were not threatened by excess. They were amused by it, and in his determination to prove his worth, Frank Woolworth was about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. As Frank Woolworth's frustration with society deepened, its consequences did not remain confined to boardrooms or dinner tables. They followed him home. The battle he was fighting for acceptance slowly became a family affair. Though no one else had chosen to enlist, Woolworth did not see his ambition as destructive. He saw it as necessary. In his mind, he was building a future not only for himself, but for his wife and daughters. What he failed to understand was that the future he envisioned did not match the people he was trying to shape. Jenny Woolworth had never wanted prominence. She had married Frank before the fortune, before Fifth Avenue, before the endless pursuit of recognition. She valued privacy, routine, and emotional stability. As her husband's wealth grew, so did the expectations placed upon her. Expensive clothes, formal dinners, carefully curated social appearances. She played the role when required, but it drained her. The society Frank longed to join offered her nothing but exhaustion and quiet resentment. Over time she withdrew, not in rebellion, but in self-preservation. Their daughters absorbed the tension without fully understanding its source. They were raised in comfort, but not in peace. Every social interaction carried weight. Every invitation, every conversation, every perceived slight mattered more than it should have. Frank wanted his daughters to succeed where he had failed. He wanted them to marry well, not for love, but for legitimacy. Through them, he believed, the Woolworth name could finally be woven into the fabric of established society. Helena, the eldest, felt this pressure most acutely. She was intelligent, sensitive, and deeply unsuited to the role her father imagined for her. She was artistic, introspective, prone to emotional extremes. These qualities unsettled Frank. He saw them not as traits to be nurtured, but as flaws to be corrected. Helena needed discipline. She needed refinement. She needed direction. At least, that was what her father told himself. In reality, she needed understanding. As expectations tightened, Helena began to fracture. What the family called nervousness was something far more serious. Periods of withdrawal alternated with intense emotional episodes, but in the world Frank Woolworth was trying to enter, mental illness was not a condition to be treated. It was a liability to be hidden, a weakness that could undermine everything he had built. So it went unspoken, unaddressed, unhealed. Edna, quieter and more accommodating, became the mediator. She smoothed over conflicts, softened conversations, absorbed stress that was never meant to be hers. The youngest, Jessie, reacted differently. She resisted. She questioned. She pushed back against her father's plans for her future. Where Helena internalized pressure until it crushed her, Jessie externalized it, setting the stage for conflict that would only intensify with time. Frank Woolworth believed he was guiding his family toward success. In truth, he was bending them toward a vision that served his own unresolved needs. Love became conditional. Approval became transactional. Emotional safety gave way to performance. The family home, wherever it was at the time, ceased to be a refuge. It became another stage on which Woolworth's worth had to be demonstrated. And as the distance between him and his family grew, Frank reached for something solid, something permanent, something that could not retreat into silence or emotional complexity. The idea that had been forming in his mind for years now took on clarity. If people could not be controlled, buildings could. If society would not grant him acceptance, he would construct it himself. The mansion was no longer just an idea. It was a solution, or so he believed. By 1911, the idea had hardened into certainty. Frank Woolworth was no longer considering whether to build his palace. He was considering how grand it would need to be to finally silence doubt. The decision was not made in a single dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, as an answer to every frustration he had been unable to resolve. Each social slight, each polite dismissal, each reminder that wealth alone was not enough, pushed him closer to the same conclusion. If New York would not accept him quietly, it would be forced to acknowledge him loudly. Woolworth chose Fifth Avenue without hesitation. It was the most prestigious address in the city, a corridor of power where proximity itself conveyed status. Building anywhere else would have undermined the point. This was not about comfort or convenience. It was about visibility. The mansion had to stand among the homes of the families who had excluded him, not as a neighbor seeking approval, but as an equal demanding recognition. He selected Cass Gilbert as architect, a deliberate choice that reflected both ambition and control. Gilbert had designed the Woolworth Building, the soaring skyscraper that already bore Frank's name across the Manhattan skyline. That tower was a monument to commercial success. The mansion would be something different, personal, intimate, unavoidable. Gilbert understood that this project was driven as much by psychology as by architecture. He listened carefully as Woolworth described his vision, a fusion of European styles that evoked permanence, tradition, and authority. There would be no single influence. French Renaissance grandeur, Italian palazzo symmetry, Gothic verticality. Woolworth wanted everything that conveyed history and legitimacy, even if it came from continents he had never set foot on. The past, after all, was what he was trying to purchase. Every element was meant to suggest that the Woolworth name belonged not just in America's present, but in its imagined aristocratic past. Budget was never discussed as a constraint. When estimates rose, Woolworth dismissed concern. Money had been the solution to every problem in his adult life. He saw no reason for it to fail him now. Rare marble would be imported from Italy. Wood paneling would come from England. Skilled craftsmen would be brought across the Atlantic to ensure authenticity. If something could not be sourced locally, it would be found elsewhere. Delays were acceptable, compromises were not. As plans took shape, Woolworth immersed himself in the process with near obsessive intensity. He reviewed every drawing, questioned every proportion, demanded revisions that often had more to do with instinct than necessity. The mansion was becoming an extension of his mind, each room a manifestation of his need for order and control. Gilbert accommodated as best he could, understanding that the client was not merely commissioning a residence. He was constructing a final argument about his own worth. In the spring of 1912, Woolworth secured the property between 80th and 81st Streets. The site was large enough to support his vision, and close enough to his social rivals to make the point unmistakable. By the time construction preparations began, the estimated cost had already surpassed what many considered reasonable, even for a man of Woolworth's means. But reason no longer played a role. This project had moved beyond practicality into belief. As the foundations were laid and the first stones prepared, few noticed what was happening inside the Woolworth household. The excitement of creation masked the growing fractures beneath it. Helena's condition continued to worsen. Jenny withdrew further into silence. Frank, consumed by the promise of what the mansion would become, mistook progress for healing. He believed that once the house stood, everything else would fall into place. Construction would soon begin in earnest. Walls would rise, marble would be carved, a palace would take shape on Fifth Avenue. But beneath the ground, unseen and unacknowledged, the foundations of Frank Woolworth's personal life were already cracking, and no amount of stone could hold them together. When construction began in earnest, the mansion rose quickly, but not quietly. Hundreds of workers moved across the Fifth Avenue site, cutting stone, pouring foundations, shaping a structure that seemed almost unreal against the Manhattan skyline. Frank Woolworth visited constantly. He arrived in tailored suits, stepped carefully across the dust and debris, and scrutinized every detail with an intensity that unsettled even experienced craftsmen. Nothing escaped his attention. A measurement slightly off, a decorative element not perfectly aligned. Each imperfection felt to him like a personal threat. Cass Gilbert attempted to manage the process with diplomacy, but Woolworth's presence was relentless. This was not a client who delegated and trusted. This was a man who needed to see his vision materialize with absolute precision. The mansion was not merely being built, it was being controlled. Every stone placed correctly reassured Woolworth that something in his life remained firmly within his grasp. As the exterior walls climbed upward, the interior began to take form. The grand marble staircase was designed to dominate the entrance, a sweeping ascent meant to impress in silence. Italian marble, quarried with difficulty and shipped at enormous cost, was shaped by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down for generations. Woolworth watched them work with fascination. He admired the discipline, the mastery, the permanence of what they produced. It was the kind of certainty he craved. The ballroom took shape on the second floor, vast and luminous, designed to hold hundreds of guests beneath gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Woolworth imagined the scene repeatedly. Society figures circulating, conversations echoing, acknowledgement finally settling into place. In his mind, the room was already full. He did not notice how empty his own house had become in the meantime. At home, the mood shifted from tension to quiet collapse. Jenny retreated further into herself, spending long hours alone, avoiding discussions about the mansion whenever possible. What was meant to be a shared triumph felt to her like an invasion. The scale that thrilled her husband suffocated her. The more the house grew, the smaller she felt within it. Helena's deterioration became impossible to ignore. Her moods darkened. She withdrew from social interactions, overwhelmed by expectations she could not meet. Doctors spoke in vague terms of nerves and exhaustion, offering treatments that addressed symptoms but not causes. Frank listened politely and dismissed their concerns privately. To him, Helena's struggles were obstacles, not warnings. He believed environment could fix what emotion could not. Beauty, order, refinement, these would shape her into the person he needed her to be. The irony was cruel. The mansion, conceived as a solution, became an amplifier. Its scale magnified silence. Its formality deepened isolation. Rooms designed for gatherings stood empty, while emotional distance widened in their shadows. Woolworth mistook construction progress for personal progress. Each completed floor reassured him that the sacrifice was justified, that the strain would soon be rewarded. By late 1914, the structure loomed over Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade commanding attention. Passers-by stopped to stare. The house was already succeeding in one respect. It could not be ignored. But attention is not acceptance, and admiration does not guarantee belonging. Inside the Woolworth family, the cost of the project was becoming unbearable. Frank remained convinced that the final result would vindicate everything. Once the mansion was finished, once society stepped inside and saw what he had built, the tension would dissolve, the family would stabilize, the wounds would heal, the doubts would disappear. He could not yet see that the cracks he was building over were not structural. They were human, and no palace, no matter how grand, could repair them. By the spring of 1916, the mansion was complete. 4 years of obsession had hardened into stone. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. The grand staircase rose in perfect symmetry, every curve calculated to inspire awe. The ballroom stood ready, gilded ceilings catching the light, polished surfaces reflecting a vision of triumph Frank Woolworth had rehearsed countless times in his mind. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the moment when effort would finally be rewarded with recognition. Invitations were sent to everyone who mattered: old families, bankers, industrialists, cultural figures. The names Woolworth had chased for decades now appeared on carefully engraved cards. This was not a request. It was an announcement. Frank believed that once these people stepped inside his palace, the debate about his place in society would be over. No one could walk through these rooms and deny what he had achieved. The evening arrived warm and clear. Cars lined Fifth Avenue. Guests ascended the marble steps, pausing instinctively to take in the scale of the entrance. Inside, servants moved silently, guiding visitors through halls designed to overwhelm the senses. Conversation softened as people looked around. The mansion succeeded in its immediate goal. It impressed. It stunned. It demanded attention, but admiration has limits. Guests spoke of the marble, the ceilings, the imported craftsmanship. They praised Woolworth's taste with careful politeness. Compliments floated through the rooms, refined and restrained. What never appeared was warmth. The conversations remained cautious, transactional. Eyes drifted past Woolworth even as hands were shaken. For many, this was not an evening of welcome. It was an evening of inspection. Frank moved through the crowd with practiced composure, except in praise that felt oddly hollow. He listened for something deeper, some shift in tone, some indication that the barrier he had battled for so long had finally fallen. It never came. The old families remained exactly where they had always been, standing just far enough away to remind him that admiration was not the same as acceptance. Jenny stood beside him when required, her presence formal and distant. She had never wanted this night, and now that it had arrived, it confirmed every fear she had carried in silence. The smiles exhausted her. The glances unsettled her. As soon as etiquette allowed, she withdrew to quieter rooms, leaving Frank to perform alone. Helena appeared briefly. The noise, the crowd, the echoing grandeur overwhelmed her almost immediately. She slipped away unnoticed, retreating to her bedroom, the one her father had designed to inspire refinement. Surrounded by painted walls and carefully chosen furniture, she sat alone while the party continued below. The contrast was devastating. A house built to host hundreds could not hold one fragile mind together. As the evening wore on, guests began to leave. Polite thanks, measured praise, cars disappearing back into the city. No new invitations were extended. No doors quietly opened. By midnight, the ballroom stood nearly empty. Servants moved in to clean, restoring order with mechanical efficiency. Glasses were removed, lights dimmed. The performance ended. Frank Woolworth remained behind. He stood alone in the vast space he had built for recognition, surrounded by echoes instead of voices. The place had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had impressed everyone who entered, and it had changed nothing. In that moment, though he may not have fully understood it, Woolworth confronted the truth he had spent his life avoiding. He had not built a bridge into society. He had built a stage on which his exclusion was made unmistakably clear. The mansion was no longer a promise. It was evidence, and the cost of that evidence would soon become impossible to ignore. After the grand opening, the mansion settled into a strange and unnatural silence. The rooms that had been designed to absorb conversation now magnified absence. Footsteps echoed too loudly. Doors closed with finality. Light moved across marble floors without witnesses. The house was complete, but life within it felt unfinished, as though something essential had failed to arrive. Frank Woolworth continued to believe the problem was temporary. That recognition would follow eventually. That society simply needed time to adjust to what he had built. What he did not acknowledge was that the house had already begun to consume the people inside it. Helena's decline accelerated. The expectations placed upon her had not lifted after the opening night. If anything, they intensified. Her father believed the mansion would shape her into the woman society required her to be. Beauty would impose discipline. Grandeur would inspire control. Instead, the scale of the house overwhelmed her. She retreated further into herself, spending long hours isolated in rooms designed for display rather than comfort. Her moods darkened. Silence replaced conversation. When she did speak, her words carried confusion and despair that frightened those who heard them. Doctors were summoned. They spoke cautiously, using the language of the era. Nervous disorders, exhaustion, emotional instability. Treatments were prescribed that reflected ignorance rather than understanding. Rest cures, isolation sedatives. None addressed the source of her suffering. Frank listened, but resisted conclusions that implicated him. To accept that his ambition had contributed to Helena's collapse would have required him to confront the cost of everything he had built. Instead, he framed her illness as a personal failing, something to be corrected through discipline and structure. Jenny watched helplessly as the house closed in around her daughter. She had already withdrawn from the social life Frank demanded, but now she withdrew emotionally as well. The mansion offered her no refuge. Its corridors felt endless, its formality oppressive. What was meant to be a family home became a place where grief and anxiety had nowhere to go. She spent hours alone, avoiding the grand rooms, retreating into smaller spaces that offered some illusion of intimacy. Frank, meanwhile, immersed himself in routine. He returned daily to his office, focusing on sales figures and expansion plans. Business responded predictably. Numbers could be managed. Problems could be solved. At home, nothing obeyed logic. The more he tried to impose order, the more disorder revealed itself. Late at night, he wandered the halls of the mansion, listening to the house settle, convincing himself that permanence equaled success. But the walls offered no reassurance. Eventually, Helena's condition could no longer be hidden. She was hospitalized, removed from the mansion under a veil of discretion meant to protect the family's reputation. The truth was softened for outsiders: health issues, a need for rest. Inside the family, the absence was unmistakable. Her room remained untouched, preserved as though she might return unchanged. The murals her father had commissioned watched over empty space, symbols of hope that had failed catastrophically. The mansion had revealed its true nature. It was not a sanctuary. It was a mirror. It reflected every unresolved conflict, every unspoken resentment, every wound that ambition had carved into the Woolworth family. What Frank had believed would elevate them instead exposed them. The grandeur did not conceal madness. It amplified it. Behind the marble walls, the cost of trying to purchase belonging had become undeniable, and the house, silent and imposing, stood as a witness to a truth Frank Woolworth could no longer escape. The success he had built so carefully had finally turned inward, and it was destroying the very people he claimed to be building it for. By 1919, the mansion no longer represented ambition, it represented endurance. Frank Woolworth's health, fragile since childhood, began to fail him once again. The same weakness that had haunted his early years returned with cruel familiarity. His breathing grew labored. Fatigue followed him constantly. Doctors spoke in hushed tones of respiratory complications, warning him to slow down. Frank listened politely and ignored them. Slowing down felt too much like surrender. He spent more time inside the mansion, not as its master, but as its prisoner. The grand rooms he had designed to impress now felt cavernous and cold. Servants moved carefully around him, lowering their voices instinctively. The house seemed to respond to his decline. Sounds softened, activity diminished. The palace grew quieter with each passing month. Frank's routines became smaller. Short walks through the halls, long periods seated alone, staring at architectural details he had once obsessed over. The carvings, the marble, the imported woods, each feature testified to his achievement, but offered no comfort. What he had built could not sustain him now. The recognition he had chased remained elusive, and time had begun to run out. Jenny remained by his side, though the distance between them never fully closed. Years of emotional strain had left scars that could not be erased by illness. Their conversations were brief, careful, circling around practical matters rather than regret. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand confession, only quiet companionship shaped by habit and shared exhaustion. The absence of Helena hung heavily over the house. Her hospitalization had removed her suffering from view, but not from memory. Frank avoided her empty room, passing its door without looking. On the rare occasions he allowed himself to think about her, the thoughts were fragmented and unresolved. There was no space left in him for confrontation, only for endurance. On April 8th, 1919, Frank Woolworth died inside the mansion he had built to secure his place in the world. The death was quiet. There were no crowds, no triumphal recognition, just a man slipping away in a room designed to project permanence. He left behind a fortune, an empire, and a house too large for the grief it now contained. The news traveled quickly. Newspapers praised his business acumen. They recounted the rise from poverty, the retail revolution, the success that had reshaped American commerce. The mansion was mentioned as an achievement, a testament to his wealth. Little was said of what it had cost, even less of what it had failed to provide. After his death, the house did not change. It stood exactly as he had left it. But its meaning shifted completely. What had once been a symbol of ambition became a monument to unfulfilled desire. The palace had outlived its creator, but it had not fulfilled his purpose. Instead, it preserved the tension, the silence, and the unanswered questions he left behind. Frank Woolworth had spent his life believing that permanence would bring peace. In death, he discovered the opposite. Stone endures long after ambition fades, long after recognition ceases to matter, and in that endurance, the mansion became something he had never intended it to be, a mausoleum built not for memory, but for regret. After Frank Woolworth's death, the mansion did not become a place of closure. It became a place of suspension. Time moved differently within its walls, slowed by grief and unresolved purpose. Jenny remained, inhabiting only a fraction of the space. Entire wings were closed off, their rooms preserved exactly as they had been, as though the past might reassert itself if left undisturbed. Servants continued their routines, but the house felt increasingly hollow, its grandeur stripped of intention. The Woolworth daughters carried their inheritance uneasily. Helena never truly recovered. Her life unfolded in fragments, marked by institutional care and prolonged absence from the world her father had tried so desperately to enter. The mansion, meant to elevate her, had become a symbol of everything that had broken her. She avoided it whenever possible, and when she could not, its scale intensified her sense of displacement. Edna married and left, seeking distance from the weight of the family legacy. Jessie, more defiant by nature, attempted to claim independence, but even rebellion could not fully sever the influence of the house. The Woolworth name followed her, shaping expectations she had never asked for. The mansion remained a silent reference point, a reminder that wealth could command attention without offering freedom. Over the years, rumors began to circulate. Visitors spoke of an oppressive atmosphere, a heaviness that settled in the air regardless of season. Servants whispered of footsteps echoing through empty halls, of rooms that felt inexplicably cold, of a sense that the house resisted occupancy. None of these stories were dramatic enough to become legends. They lingered instead as unease, as something people felt but struggled to articulate. The mansion passed through phases of partial use and gradual decline. It was too large to function as a private residence, too personal to be repurposed easily. Attempts to redefine it never fully succeeded. The house seemed resistant to new identities, as though it remained anchored to the ambition that had created it. What Frank Woolworth had built to assert permanence now resisted change. To the outside world, the mansion stood as a monument to Gilded Age excess. To those who lived within it, it felt like an unresolved argument. The walls bore witness to decades of emotional strain, of expectations imposed and unmet. Each generation inherited not only wealth, but the psychological residue of a man who had believed belonging could be constructed. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment when the curse revealed itself unmistakably. Instead, it manifested quietly, in estrangement, in illness, in a persistent sense that something fundamental had gone wrong and could not be corrected. The mansion endured, but the family gradually receded from it, leaving behind a structure that no longer served those it was built for. What remained was a question that no one could answer directly. Had Frank Woolworth succeeded or failed, the empire endured, the name survived, but the house, standing silent on Fifth Avenue, suggested a more complicated truth. That ambition without belonging leaves behind more than monuments. It leaves behind spaces that echo long after the people who needed them are gone. Today, the Woolworth Mansion no longer functions as Frank Woolworth intended. It has been repurposed, renovated, stripped of much of its private history. To the public eye, it is an architectural artifact, a relic of Gilded Age excess, a curiosity from a time when wealth sought to announce itself through stone and scale. Visitors admire its facade, its symmetry, its craftsmanship. Few ask why it was built in the first place. Fewer still consider what it failed to do. Frank Woolworth believed the mansion would complete his transformation, that it would erase the distance between who he had been and who he wanted to be seen as. In this belief, he was not unique. The house stands as an extreme expression of a familiar human impulse, the desire to externalize worth, to make achievement visible enough that doubt has nowhere to hide. Woolworth assumed that if success could be made permanent, so could belonging. But belonging does not obey architecture. It cannot be forced through scale or purchased through excess. It exists only where recognition is mutual and unspoken. Woolworth never understood this, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his life had taught him a different lesson, that survival required proof, that dignity had to be earned repeatedly, that acceptance was conditional. The mansion was his final proof, and his final misunderstanding. In building the house, Woolworth succeeded in creating something enduring. Stone outlasted him. Marble preserved his ambition long after his voice was gone. But permanence is not the same as meaning. The mansion remembers him not as he wished to be remembered, but as he truly was. A man defined by effort, wounded by exclusion, driven by a need no amount of success could satisfy. The tragedy of the Woolworth Mansion is not that it ruined a family, it is that it revealed one. It exposed the cost of confusing recognition with love, visibility with acceptance, achievement with peace. What Woolworth built could not protect his children, it could not heal his marriage, it could not quiet his fear of being dismissed. Instead, it amplified everything he had tried to escape. Standing there now, silent and composed, the mansion offers no judgment. It does not accuse. It does not absolve. It simply exists. A reminder that wealth can construct monuments, but not meaning. That ambition can reshape cities, but not the human heart. And that the most dangerous structures are not those built too large, but those built to answer questions architecture was never meant to solve. The Woolworth Mansion was never just a house. It was a confession made in stone, and like all confessions left unanswered, it still echoes.